Hello, Tim.
Hi, Miriam.
I almost wanted to say welcome on the show, but you've been here before, but unfortunately my microphone let us down.
Yes,
So
well, it's nice to have a chance to do it again.
exactly. So I'm glad that you found time to have maybe the same, maybe a similar, maybe a different conversation with me.
Well, yeah, we'll find out.
Yeah, as long as we talk about good talking rules. So
Yes,
how
10
can we
rules for
have
talking.
exactly how can we have better conversations?
Yeah.
And before we dive into that, when did you start being interested in conversations and rules of talking?
Um, I think I've always been interested in conversations. I've always enjoyed, and I mean, my job as a psychologist, but something I valued was the opportunity to sit with people and have conversations about things that meant something to them.
Mm.
And I think for me, that was one of the privileges of being a psychologist was you got to have a lot of conversations with a lot of people. And that, I think when you talk with friends, with your close friends, you tend to have meaningful and deep conversations. And I just appreciated having a job where I did that quite a lot.
Mhm.
Um, so I enjoyed that. And, I think when you do anything, you require a certain amount of practice in it. And I became practiced in those conversations and talking to people who wanted to talk to me and talking to people where we had a shared agenda, which is that the other person wanted to understand something about their lives or wanted to express a idea or an emotion.
Mm.
Um, and then I stopped working as a psychologist in private practice and I moved into an organization. And suddenly I found that that kind of conversation that I was very practiced in was not the kind of conversation that I was required to have on a daily basis.
Mm.
And I was required to have new kinds of conversations. And I suddenly realized I wasn't quite as good at those new conversations as I was at the ones that I had a lot of practice in.
So were these new kind of conversations then some that were more practical and less, air quotes, meaningful and deep? Or what was the key difference between these
Well,
conversations?
that would have been one of them, a practical, let's turn an idea into action, for sure.
Mhm.
That would be one kind of conversation. Another kind of conversation would be where the person didn't necessarily want to come and talk to me. Because when you're a
Explain that.
psychologist, it's, when you're a psychologist, it's unusual that the person you're talking to, now it does happen. And in fact, I did specialize in one kind of those conversations. When I was a young man, I'd work quite a lot with naughty boys.
Mhm.
And naughty boys would get sent to see me because either their parents or their teachers felt that they were naughty. And often the boys didn't feel that they were naughty. So they didn't feel that there was a problem. And they'd find themselves in front of, this psychologist. But fortunately, at the time, I was a young man and we could kind of relate. And I'd been a naughty boy myself, according to some people. So, so we had that in common. Um, but but by and large, when you're a psychologist, you're talking to people who want to talk to you. Whereas I found myself having conversations with people who didn't necessarily want to hear what it was that I had to say, or didn't necessarily value my input or my perspective.
Mhm.
And so it was a learning. I needed to learn how to cope with that kind of situation. So that was another situation. And then obviously where our agendas were not aligned, that was a third kind of scenario that I had to learn to cope with on a more regular basis.
And I think this brings us right to the core of the struggles that I think many in my audience have. Most of them are workshop facilitators, so they're
Yes,
groups. Their opinions might not be aligned. They might not
right.
like each other. They might not be interested what they have to tell to each other.
Yes.
So do you think maybe as a one step into this kind of conversation, do you think that they apply different rules when you have these one-on-one conversations versus group conversations?
Um, I, when I wrote the book, 10 Rules for Talking, I, I initially planned for it to be about one-on-one
Mm-hmm.
conversations. But I do think, and as I was writing it, I thought to myself, and I realized that these rules, the rules of talking, apply whether we're having professional conversations or even political conversations, public conversations. So I think some of the rules around, for example, respecting the person that we're talking to, listening to the person that we're talking to, trying to be clear, trying not to simplify, trying to be practical. I think these apply in individual and in group contexts. The actual principles. Now, obviously, when you're listening, when there's a group of people, then the listening is slightly different to how it may be when there are two of you. But what I also tried to do in the book is I tried to talk about really the reasons why some of these things are difficult, because all of us really know how to listen, and I mean, if you go onto the internet and you type listening skills into Google, you're going to come up with the same list of 7 things or 5 things or whatever it is. But everybody knows what listening skills are. You've got to look at the person, you've got to smile, you've got to nod, you've got to say yes every now and again, and ask a question when they fall silent. Those are the basic listening skills. But the thing is, sometimes it's not easy to listen. And sometimes it's not easy to listen because we're being threatened in some way, emotionally, in terms of our identity or our ego, or in terms of our beliefs. And then this is when we have to work harder to maintain those good listening skills. And it may be that in a group situation, for example, I'm being challenged in more directions because there are more opinions out there. And I've got to make sure that I'm able to control my own sensitivities in order to keep listening.
Because if I understand you correctly, it's basically we have this warning system inside of us that if someone is threatening my inner beliefs, I better not listen too much because otherwise this could be harmful for me.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. It's a great, it's a very effective technique. Just stop listening.
Yeah. And then, well, it's maybe short-sighted.
Yes.
So our instincts worked back in the days, but today it's maybe not as effective.
Yeah.
But this means that the way how you understand or define rules of talking, it's not only talking as in speaking, as in one-sided. I use my mouth and my body in order to verbalize my ideas.
Yeah.
But it's more this back and forth. So it implies listening and speaking.
Yes. And, I mean, one of the questions I had to ask when I was writing the book is obviously, why are you writing a book when there's so many great books in this genre? There's Crucial Conversations, which is an incredibly good book. There's Difficult Conversations, which is written by the Harvard Negotiation Project. So this is a group of people who are involved in negotiating the end of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the end of apartheid. This is an incredibly experienced group of people who've got this wonderful book that they've written. Getting to Yes is another amazing book from the genre. And what they do is they write incredibly powerfully about a process that you should follow in order to have good conversations. And I don't think I really said anything new about the process of what steps to follow. But what I did want to talk about is that in order to be able to follow those steps, you need to have good relationship skills, you need to have good resilience, and you need to have good critical thinking skills. So what I really wanted to do with the book was write about why sometimes it's easy to follow the processes and why sometimes it's difficult to follow the processes, and what to do when you're finding it hard.
So what makes it easy or difficult to follow the process, and how can we overcome it? So I assume it's when you feel threatened, it becomes more difficult.
Well, that would be the one, yes. So when I feel threatened, and then that's when what resilience is about is an accurate response to threat. So resilience is not about having a low response to threat. It's about responding appropriately to threat.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I've got a naughty dog.
Mm-hmm.
And when I walk my dog in the forest, he likes to chase squirrels. And one of the things that I've got to do is I've got to figure out how worried should I be about this? Because if I'm not worried enough, the dog's going to get lost. If I'm too worried about it, I'm not going to go on enough walks.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got to find the right balance of showing the right amount of concern for the problem. And if, for example, I'm having a conversation with somebody and I start to feel under threat, I've got to do exactly the same thing. I've got to figure out, does this person pose a risk to me or my desires in some way? Because if they do, if this person is genuinely hostile or has some kind of genuinely malign intent, I do need to respond with alarm.
Mm-hmm.
And I do need to take action about this. On the other hand, if it's just me, that if I'm being oversensitive about something, or if I'm mistaking some past anxiety or past danger for a present situation, then it would be incorrect for me to respond to a perceived threat when the threat is actually not real. So that's part of resilience, is having an accurate response and responding to real threats when they are there, but not responding to non-existent threats when they're not there. It's not, and I think a lot of people think resilience is about just kind of sucking it up and
Mm-hmm.
never worrying about things. But actually there are two sides to it. We don't want false positives and we don't want false negatives either.
Yeah, they can both be dangerous. And then it's a
Absolutely.
question of self-awareness or having a right intuition for the situation. Because obviously,
Yes.
if I'm confronted with a terrorist or with someone with a
Yes.
gun or a baseball stick in their head,
Yes.
I might have good reasons to respond.
Absolutely. Yes.
Stressed.
Get out of there.
Yeah, exactly. But if I'm in a conversation where, yes, I perceive it as harmful because maybe my identity, maybe my job, maybe my status is at stake.
Yes.
How do I know what the accurate response is, and how do I translate that then into speaking words?
And obviously an absolutely key question. So and this is where, even though I was writing a book about talking, I wanted to be able to answer some of these questions. So rule 6 is use resilience. And for me, the best approach to resilience comes from, first of all, a classic cognitive behavioral therapy technique called ABC. And secondly, about some work that Martin Seligman did, the positive psychologist, did on evaluating threat. And to start with the CBT approach, what the CBT approach is it says that we have adversity and we have a consequence. Mm-hmm. So I have a situation and I have an emotional consequence. For example, I experience a sense of alarm. But they say in between the adversity and the consequence, in between the A and the C, there's a B. Mm-hmm. And the B is, what do I believe? Mm. And the alarm or the anxiety that I feel is connected to a belief that I face a future threat. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing is that I have a range of negative emotions. For example, sadness. Sadness, the consequence of sadness is linked to a belief that I have lost something. Anger is linked to a belief that my rights have been violated in some way. Guilt is linked to a belief that I violated somebody else's rights. Embarrassment is linked to a belief that I've been evaluated negatively in some way. So all of these beliefs, these specific beliefs, lead to specific emotions. Mm-hmm. But often we detect the emotion without being aware of the belief. Mm. So for starters, we've got to be conscious enough to reverse engineer the belief from the emotion. So if I'm walking around one day just feeling sad, all of us, well, I imagine
we all have
all of
these
us
situations.
have days sometimes where we're just not feeling great. We're just kind of
Yeah.
feeling a little bit down or a little bit sad. And sometimes we have these kind of days and we don't even know what it is that we're feeling sad about.
Mm-hmm.
But we can reverse engineer that and ask ourselves, what is it that I'm feeling that I've lost? What is missing? So that thought doesn't immediately come to us. What immediately comes to us is the emotion.
Why do I feel sad? Which is not helpful at all.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas if I can generate, if I
Yeah.
can start to understand the belief,
Yeah.
or if it comes to anger, for example, that anger is connected to a belief that somebody has violated a right of mine. So, and then when it comes to anxiety, anxiety is connected to a belief that I'm being threatened in some way, or I face a future threat. So that's kind of the starting point of when I start to feeling anxious in a conversation, I need to reverse engineer this to that I believe in some way that I'm facing some kind of a threat.
And this is interesting because when I imagine a conversation, usually it's back and forth, and I can hardly imagine that I tell you, okay, hold on, Tim. I feel anger coming up. Give me 5 minutes. I need to backwards engineer to find out where this is coming from, and then ask you the question whether you're really threatening my status here.
Yes.
So what
Great point. Great point. Critical point. And I've got two answers to that. The one is John Gottman, who's one of the world's leading couple therapists, doesn't ask for 5 minutes, he asks for 20 minutes. So he actually does this.
Awesome.
Now, this guy is the best couple psychologist in the world. And he says that there's certain situations that you just can't fix unless you go away and calm down. So that's kind of interesting in itself. The second point is that so often with these conversations that go wrong, they end up recurring. They happen again and again and again. So if it's gone badly once, chances are you're going to end up having it again. Because if it had gone well, you would have sorted it out and you wouldn't have to have it again. So you actually have time to reflect and to take a learning from a previous failure into another circumstance.
Would you then recommend to keep something like a talking diary? So if I want to be better at talking, then I imagine that I have this book with me. And every time that I realize, okay, something is going wrong, or I have these feelings, then I take a note, backward engineer, and say next time, hold on, don't give me 5 minutes, give me 2 seconds, because I have it somewhere in here.
You know, I hadn't thought of that, but that sounds like a really good idea to me. And
yeah, maybe you can create a workbook together with your book.
And, you know, I mean, now you say that, I'm reminded of I worked with a referee, a rugby referee. And this guy had refereed a World Cup final in rugby. Now, you probably don't watch rugby much, but, you know,
I know a little bit about rugby.
Okay. And he had exactly that. He had a book, and he said there are only so many things that can happen on a rugby field. And he had written 2 comments for every single thing that can happen on a rugby field. So as you say, he didn't need 5 minutes. He just had it ready. So, you know, one of the rules in the book is rule 4, which is talk fast and slow. So sometimes talking fast is just about being creative and spontaneous, and talking slow is about being practiced and deliberate and careful. And I suppose, you know, your suggestion about having a book where you write things down, that's talking slow. You know, that's being careful, and that's thinking and being methodical.
And it's maybe also about creating a shortcut. So you're talking slow at some point to speed up later on, because you already reflected on it. Yeah.
And, you know, and that, what you've just said, I think that is one of the key things of conversations, is that often fast is slow and slow is fast. So if we can just appreciate that, that when we feel drawn to be fast, sometimes that's the time to be slow.
especially when something is at stake, or when we're talking to different people who might have different opinions, because it's so difficult to pinpoint when we actually threaten someone. I think sometimes it's really subtle.
Right.
Because we, especially in these fast speaking moments, maybe in the best case it's about ideas, in the worst case it's about politics or religion.
Yeah.
And then things get fast.
Yes.
And we might not even realize when we're stepping on someone's toes. How would you, exactly in this situation, I'm thinking about two types of individuals. There are those who speak to think and those who think to speak. How would you recommend them to have better conversations?
I think the listening, whatever kind of talking you're doing, you do have to observe the effect that you're having on the person that you're talking to. Mm-hmm. And that can guide that's feedback. And that hopefully can guide your talking. And I worked with a goalkeeper who, when he was young, played in a senior team, and he had a very senior footballer in front of him playing in defense. And at the end of the game, the senior footballer said, "Why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you give me any information? I want to know what you see." Mm-hmm. And he was quite surprised because he thought, I'm the junior, I can't tell him what to do. But the senior guy was saying, "Give me information. I want information." And this is something I've heard quite a lot from footballers, is they want information. The best footballers are always looking around. They're always swiveling their heads because they want information. And they know when they don't have information. And I think this is something that we should cultivate as talkers, is a desire for information. A desire for information about how our message is being received.
How our message is being received, and also learning from these footballers that information is just information.
Yes.
As a piece of data that I can learn from, that is feedback, and that is not a threat.
Yes. Yes. And that is, it comes back to rule 6, use resilience. If I can accept something as information, and if I was to say something and you were to frown or to, look quizzical or to shake your head, now I could feel threatened and I could feel on the spot and go, "Oh, well, what have I done?" Or "Don't you agree with me?" Or "Is there some kind of problem?" Or it could cause me to reflect on what I'm saying, either to assess whether what I'm saying is correct or not, or whether I haven't explained it sufficiently clearly. Mm-hmm. But yes, if I can use that as information, as data, rather than as a comment on myself.
Yeah. And you mentioned sportsman a couple of times, and I know that you work with sports teams and have worked with sports teams in the past. So what is the magic about communication in team sports? Because I can imagine that, as you just described, in two soccer players, they need to exchange information, but I think it goes beyond words because they don't have time to go into deep conversations. Yes. So what do you observe, and what do you think that non-sports teams, but maybe business teams, can learn from that?
Okay, well, as you said that, without words, I did work with a footballer, and he would just go, "Ah," as he ran. He'd never say anything. He'd never say, "Pass me the ball." He'd just shout like that and expect it. And I think everybody kind of knew what he meant. And I worked with another coach, and that coach used to say, "Communicate with movement." Mm-hmm. So don't call for the ball, move for the ball. And, you know, I never really thought of your question before, but I wonder in some ways if that is an idea that you couldn't take into the business world is,
Yeah.
you know, because what the coach was saying is create the opportunity. Don't just ask for something, provide a solution, because you're moving into space and you're providing a solution for somebody. And then you may need to call after you've moved to attract their attention. So, you know, I wonder if that's not one thing. And then I do think the other thing I would say in teams is when teams really start to work, everybody wants the same thing. And they believe that the best way for them to achieve the same thing is for the other person to do well and to perform at their best. So that would be an observation. I think what's also interesting about sports is that different sports require different forms of communication. A sport like football, for example, is a very free-flowing game. So footballers tend to like a practical, precise communication because it's hard to vague things don't work in football because football is already a sport that's quite hard to describe. You know, it's not like going forwards is always good in football and going backs is always good, is always bad. It's not like always passing successfully is good because sometimes you need to take risks. So footballers like to have precise communication. But then when I worked in a sport like cricket, which is a very measurable sport, you know, you score 1 run, 2 runs, 3 runs, and so on, or you go out or you're not out. There, because it's quite an individual sport, that sport became around emotional support. So it was quite interesting to me that it was almost like in the very clearly defined practical sport like cricket, the players wanted to talk about how to emotionally support each other. Whereas in a sport like football, they want to talk precise and exact. And if this happens, then I do that and get more practical.
Is it because they have this group support already? If I'm in a team and then it's our win, and it's also,
Yes.
I imagine when I think of a team, teams functions best when every member of the team has a very specific role, knows what they're there for, everyone knows about this distinct role and respects this person. Because only if I know that this, from the example you pointed out before, the goalkeeper knew this person, what they would do, and therefore ask him, okay, tell me what you want from me, tell me what you do, because there's this respect and I know why you're there in the first place. In cricket, it might then be different.
Yes. You know, I think in football, so if you and I were in a team where I could practically help you, so if you were working on a report, for example, and I could read the report while you were doing it and you know, maybe offer suggestions or that kind of thing, then that's a little bit like football. Because in football, somebody's got a problem, but you can go and help that person right there and then. Whereas in the sport of cricket, you can't help anybody practically. So I don't know exactly what it might be preparing somebody to go and give a speech, for example, that when they're giving that speech, you can't help them. They're up there on the stage alone. Or maybe somebody's got to go and give a sales pitch or, you know, or go into a negotiation. Then that would be a situation where that person can't be practically helped by you in that moment. And that's when I think the emotional support is important also, because you're saying to them, look, go and do your best. I will support you. If it goes well, I'm delighted. If it doesn't go well, I'm still here for you. I'm still going to support you, and we're going to learn from it, and we're going to carry on. So it's a slightly different message, I think.
Yeah. And I would be curious to see whether there are actually some similarities in teams. I could think of, a team of salespeople where once they go to a client, they're on by themselves. versus a group of programmers, for instance.
Right. Yeah.
And the group of programmers, they do have their Scrum Master, right? So they do their daily stand-ups, and
Yes.
there's a reason why it's called Scrum.
Yes.
And I wonder whether it's similar. But well, this might be a different a different episode.
Well, maybe maybe people can let us know.
Yeah. How would you, I assume that you do give trainings in talking.
Yes.
So how do you help groups to communicate better with your rules? Is there kind of a golden rule and something that derives from that?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't say a golden rule. I think there are really 4 skills that I would talk about. The one is the process of communication. So you've got to know what the steps are. Mm-hmm. So one example of a process is that if you're trying to be convincing, it's better to lead with your observations than your opinion. Mm-hmm. So it's more effective to go, it's August, it's been a clear blue sky the whole day, and there's no wind at all. I think it's going to be sunny tomorrow. So I've led with 3 with 3 observations, and then I'm going to an opinion. That's a more persuasive way of doing things than going, I think the sun's going to shine tomorrow. And then you might say to me, well, what makes you think that? But by the time you've said that, we've already got into some kind of conflict. And if you've already made up your mind that the sun's not going to shine tomorrow, I can tell you all my theories about that the wind's not blowing and the blue
and then I'm
sky,
not listening blah, blah, blah. Again because of the reasons you told us before.
But we're done.
Yeah.
So that's an example of a process, and I call it the 030. 3 observations and 1 opinion. Mm-hmm. And that would be 1 skill. But the other skills, like I said, are things like resilience, things like critical thinking and relationship skills. Mm. And those are important for groups to have as well.
And does it then depend on what the aim of a conversation is? Because sometimes, as you mentioned, we are talking to negotiate. Sometimes we want to convince someone. Sometimes we just blubber. And sometimes these blubbering conversations are actually the most difficult or the most dangerous ones.
Yes.
Because you don't even think what you're talking about, and suddenly you're in a fight.
Yeah. And again, I mean, I used to say to sports coaches sometimes, there's a thing called a passionate rant. Mm-hmm. And the sports coach just starts getting passionate about, come on, you've got to do your best and you've got to try harder, and you need to do this and you need to do that. And it's, as you say, it's just someone's just blathering on. There's no objective to that, and that is why I made rule number 1: agree what you're talking for. Agree on the purpose of this conversation, because we can save ourselves so much time and effort by choosing what it is that we want to get out of this conversation.
Would this be something that you make very explicit every time you talk to someone?
Well, I think every time you end up in disagreement, mm-hmm. and, again, it comes back to that rule about talk fast and slow, mm-hmm. that there are times, and this is one of the points that I want to make, is that most people are very good at talking most of the time. Mm-hmm. So when things are going well, there's no real reason to stop and start adding rules in. But every now and again, we get stuck. And this is a time to stop and think and put in a rule. And this is when we do need to make it clear about what we're talking for. Mm. And, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine about the Black Lives Matter movement. Mm-hmm. And, I'd known him for years, and I'd kind of assumed that we had exactly the same opinion about this topic. And I was a little surprised to realize that we didn't. So this ended up in a back and forth. Unfortunately, we're good friends, so we've got the relationship side of things that's fairly strong, which meant that we were able to have quite a prolonged disagreement about this topic. But eventually I said to him, what we really need to talk about here is, how do we know things? We need to talk about the process by which we come to forming an opinion. And in a way, I said, we need to be thinking about things like systemic racism or microaggressions or the objectives of the Black Lives Matter movement in a scientific way. So we have to have rules about what forms of evidence we accept and what forms of evidence we don't accept. We need to have rules about how we draw conclusions. And so the first part of our conversation is, let's stop trying to agree on the issue of systemic racism, and let's start trying to agree about the evidence and the logic that we're going to be using to draw a conclusion. So we actually have to start talking about the process of the conversation before we have the conversation.
And this is, I guess, a very difficult thing to do, to basically pull the brake in the middle of a heated discussion.
Yeah.
Say, okay,
yeah.
let's agree on some rules first.
Yes. But it comes back to your point that sometimes the fastest way is the slow way.
Yeah. And it depends also on what is the driver for this conversation.
Yeah.
What do you actually aim to achieve? Is
Yes.
it really convincing someone, or is it just venting?
Yeah. I think, and that's where we have to be honest with ourselves. But
Yes.
but that is a big point. Yes.
Yeah. And which leads maybe in a less serious discussion, but something that I guess many can relate to, is we're in these groups and there's always this one person who just wouldn't stop talking.
Right.
And I would be really curious in your opinion or advice, also as a psychologist.
Yes.
So where does it come from? Is it a person who's totally ignorant of other people, maybe, or is it that they need more attention? And what is the best way to deal with that?
Yeah, wow. I've had that situation as well. It's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are two potential ways to deal with it. The one is to give some sort of subtle hint, and the other would be to address it explicitly. So the subtle hint would be something like maybe not giving them quite a bigger smile when they put up their hand, maybe not looking at them to invite them to talk, that kind of thing. Maybe interrupting them a little bit sooner than you would interrupt somebody else. I think that would be a subtle hint. Whereas I think the explicit, and my preference is often to go explicit, because then at least we've brought things out into the open, and things that can then be discussed. And I do think rule one of establishing, well, what is this workshop for? And to be absolutely explicit about that, then people's contributions can be measured against that objective, and it should be a group objective, or it should be an objective that everybody signed up to. And, I think in that situation, one of the options would be to invite reflection on whether this particular direction of the conversation is aligned with the objectives that we set for the conversation. So it could be simply assessing relevance. Is what you're saying relevant to the objectives of the conversation? And, it's a legitimate topic, and it could be discussed. And then I think the other one could be to have, during a break period, a one-on-one conversation with the person. And one of the other rules is rule 6, keep the conversation safe. Sorry, rule 5, keep the conversation safe. And one of the things about safe conversations is that the word share is more or less 50-50 or more or less evenly distributed amongst the group.
Yeah.
So that as soon as one person's doing more of the talking than another person, it risks the safety of the conversation.
Mm. Yeah, and then a timer might make sense, because I think that very often those individuals who just speak for so long, they might not even aware of it. And then maybe just a simple timer and a one-on-one a safe conversation one-on-one to point that out might actually help.
Yes, that maybe they're not intending to kind of monopolize. Maybe they're just so enthusiastic, maybe they're enjoying the workshop so much.
Or they have a different perception of time.
Yes.
Or they just have no one else who would listen to them. Yeah. So unfortunately there is no magic trick to that. I was hoping for that somehow.
Okay. Sorry, no.
According to you, what makes a workshop fail?
When I think of the workshops that I've run, where I felt like I'm struggling here, I think one of the hardest situations is where people don't want to contribute. Where people, to me, that is the number one. When I think of the toughest ones that I've done, and the ones that I've reflected back on and gone, that didn't go well, or that was a failure. I think I've done workshops where my material maybe wasn't that great, where, I was inexperienced. But I think as long as people are contributing, and as long as you've got a group discussion, and this is, one of the things that I've always tried to do. And, I've always tried to be respectful of the wisdom and the knowledge of the people in the room. And I think as long as people are sharing that, then things can go well. And I mean, when I think of some of the best workshops I've ever done, I hardly talk at all. And I mean, I did one with a professional cricket team, and, you've got like these incredibly experienced world-class cricketers who all sharing their own opinions and their own thoughts. And I'm just standing there learning more than anyone because I'm not the cricketer. So, that was a great situation. And I won't say what sport it was in, but I've done workshops with athletes from another sport. Nobody wanted to say a word. And the thing is, it doesn't matter how well I've prepared, how great all my material is, blah, blah, blah. I find those quite hard.
Two questions come to my mind. One is also referring to your earlier observation that in a team sport, sometimes this sense of safety and group belonging might be less important. So was the other team you referred to, was it maybe a team sports team?
Yes, it was actually.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think in that one, people were scared of saying something wrong and losing face. That's what stopped. Well, I think there were two things. I think that was the one. And the other one was that they were questioning my credibility. They weren't totally sure how credible or how much authority I really had. And I think those were the two obstacles to the success of that workshop.
And this is a very threatening, challenging moment also for the facilitator or trainer, because the moment where you force too much in, I'm going to show you how credible I am.
Yes.
The more you actually risk of losing it.
It's true. Yeah.
And then I think then it's counterintuitive to actually open that space to let them talk.
Yes.
And let them feel safe. And then you as a facilitator or trainer, you also move out of the radar.
Yes.
How did you
Yes. I went to another, so I was in one workshop, and we actually had a human resources person come in, and they were talking about sick leave. And this is when I was working, preparing for the World Cup with a Saudi Arabia national team. And we had a person come in from human resources and talk about what happens if you take sick leave. And people were saying, well, if I get sick, I've got to separate myself from the players, because everybody's in a hotel, and if anybody gets sick, it could spread really quickly. And the human resources person said, well, maybe you can work from home. And the person said, well, I'm a goalkeeping coach. It's my job to kick foot. How can I work from home? And it was just this terribly awkward moment where, and I think everybody kind of, well, I certainly felt for the facilitator, because, I've had terrible moments like that myself. But it's what you're saying, is that she felt her credibility to be under threat, and then tried to kind of make up for it with a clever suggestion, but then that made things even worse. And it's I think for sure that can be a tough situation.
Yeah. So how would you create today the psychological safety in such, for I think, highly competitive human beings, after all?
Yeah.
Because if you're a professional sports person, you must be competitive, right? So you have a very specific character.
Mostly, yes.
Otherwise,
yes.
You wouldn't have self-selected and survived such a career.
Yes, that is true. There are some who just really, really love their sport. Mm-hmm. But that's, they're all, well, most of them love their sport. There are some who are not competitive at all. They just absolutely love their sport so much that they just want to play. But the majority of them, yes, they are competitive people, and they've had to fight to get to where they are.
Yeah. So how do you create this atmosphere where they can actually share and talk?
Well, I couldn't say that I've solved that in every situation. In the times where it has worked, I think it's to kind of make it a human conversation. Mm-hmm. That I'm not questioning them on their expertise at things that they're supposed to be good at. So I'm not asking cricketers how to play a cover drive, or what ball to bowl in this particular situation. I'm asking them how to express loyalty, or I'm asking them what they consider to be fair. And that I found really opened up the conversation when they felt like I was asking them for their human opinion rather than their expert opinion. Now, as it happened in that particular workshop, because it was about emotional support, that was rule one. That was what we were there for. So, yeah, that's what worked in that case.
And I think, again, it's easily transferable to the non-sports professional business world. That as soon as you give participants permission to show up as humans as opposed to experts,
right? Okay.
Roles in a hierarchy. I think this generally opens up the conversation, makes it more human, and therefore maybe more safe.
Okay. You say that. I did a workshop once, which was almost one of those. They didn't ask me back, which kind of, in some ways, sort of constituted a failure. But it was one of those where I felt like the best work was done by the people talking. And it was in a financial company. It was in a hedge fund. And they had all of these analysts, and then they had so the way it works in a hedge fund is you've got the hedge fund managers, who kind of the superstars, and then you've got the analysts who want to become hedge fund managers maybe one day. So they're working desperately hard to try and impress everybody and all do their best, and they're competing with each other because they know that only a few of them can ever become hedge fund managers. And then you've got the head of the whole thing, who's like the ultra superstar that everybody wants to impress most of all. And yes, I do remember it was it was a young woman actually who was really bright, very practical, and was quite confident in expressing her opinion, but was told a few times that she wasn't fitting into the hierarchy. And she was labeled as bossy or, talkative. And I do remember thinking to myself, if this had been a 35-year-old man saying exactly the same words, those labels would never have been applied. And it did strike. So at one stage, after somebody had said something to her, she stopped and she said, "I'm not bossy." And she was just kind of saying it to herself. She was saying, "I don't think of myself like this. I'm just speaking my ideas." And that was kind of interesting. And I suppose what that was a failure for the group to speak to each other as human beings. And that the roles, everybody was conscious of roles, the position in the hierarchy, gender, what people's objectives were. So, yeah, that was a workshop that I look back on, and I think, it didn't go as well as I would have wanted it to. And there were a few dynamics that I didn't quite kind of get hold of there.
Yeah. And they happen. The good thing is it's the best food for improvement and really learning.
Yes.
Because once we lived it, it won't happen again.
Well, yeah. I mean, hopefully, hopefully we can reflect on it and do something about it.
Yeah. Or have someone to reflect with it about it.
Yeah.
I think this always helps.
Yeah.
What is your favorite exercise that you do with the group or with the sports team even?
My favorite one is there's a book called The Righteous Mind by a writer called Jonathan Haidt. And his book is about the idea that as human beings, we have moral appetites. So he says that human beings are born with an innate morality. And so while we're born with the ability to taste different tastes, he says we have an appetite, and there are experiments to show that even very young children will respond differently to people who either observe or break certain moral imperatives. And what he says is that the first morality of human beings is that we should care for others rather than harm them. That's number one. The second one is that we should be free rather than oppressive. The third is that we should be fair rather than unfair, loyal rather than disloyal, respectful rather than disrespectful. And the sixth one is that we should be observant of some form of purity or sanctity or divinity, which relates to the idea that some things are just wrong and some things are just right. And he gives an example of this. He says, a family are sitting on their front veranda one day and their dog gets run over. So they take it inside and they skin it and they cook it and they eat it for supper. Is there anything wrong with that? And most people go, I don't like that idea. I can't say exactly why it's wrong because the dog was dead, but it doesn't seem right. And when you say that you don't think it's right to cook and eat your dead dog, it's because you believe in some form of sanctity or divinity. You believe that that dog is due some form of respect or care even after it's dead. So you've got these 6 moral imperatives: care, fairness, freedom, authority, loyalty, and divinity. But the thing is, they conflict with each other. Because if I'm loyal to you, I might have to be unfair to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
What if I like you and I'm really loyal to you, but it means that I exclude somebody else from a certain opportunity?
Mm-hmm.
Or what if I really care about freedom, but freedom means that I act in a way that is disrespectful to somebody else?
Mm-hmm.
Or what if in order to care for somebody, I have to harm somebody else? So I find that this conversation about morality is something that we all are passionately interested in. We're all moral creatures,
Mm-hmm.
and we're all actually very versed in these moral conversations because we talk about morality our whole lives. We talk about what's fair and what's not fair. This is one of the major kinds of conversations that we have, is moral conversations. When I'm trying to decide whether my son or I should pack the dishwasher, what do we do? You know, is it about fairness, that I packed it yesterday, he should pack it today?
Mm-hmm.
Is it about freedom, that he's a young man and he can do what he wants? Is it about authority, that I'm the dad and he must listen to what I say? Which one of these moral imperatives applies to this particular situation? And I find these to be fantastically interesting conversations. And this was the great conversation that I had with the cricket team, for example. I said, right, these are the things that we want to achieve. We want authority, that the team has a captain, the team has a coach, but we also want freedom. How do we balance these? We want fairness, but we also want loyalty. How do we balance these? And I just find it amazing to listen to the expertise and the wisdom of people, because when it comes to morality, we're all very wise. We're all very practiced.
And I love the framing in this exercise, because by saying that we're talking about morality, you put it into this philosophical box that
Yes.
you basically take the emotions away. But
Yes.
I think this should be like this should be like that. No, you have this moral standard, and then you're looking for arguments that are pro or against. So you're lifting the conversation on a totally different level.
Yes, and to acknowledge that conflict is inevitable.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the thing with morality.
Yeah, and it doesn't need to be emotional. Yeah.
As long as you acknowledge that where the conflict is coming from. If we acknowledge that the conflict is inevitable, then conflict is not personal. Yeah. And when it's not personal, it's not emotional.
I love that. I will give it a try in my next conversation. I'm not waiting for a workshop.
Yeah,
for this to happen.
Yeah, I found it to be fantastic. You know, it's I've really enjoyed it. And what binds people is when we share attitudes towards those 6 moralities. So my group will agree on the priority and the balance between those 6.
Yeah.
And that's what makes us feel understood and feel part of a group. So, you know, I may be part of a group where authority is quite important to us, you know, that we're respectful and we do what we're told. And then we're prepared that freedom is a little further down the hierarchy. And then care, maybe, you know, we're more interested in fairness, that you work hard and you get what you deserve. And if you don't work hard, we're not going to care for you quite as much. We'll still care for you if you really, really need it. But, you know, that may be my group, or my group may be more, no, care is the most important thing. The first thing that we do, never mind fairness. Everybody gets what they need. That's what matters to us most. Authority is not a big thing. You know, for sure, kids have got to listen to their parents, but we're not going to have a captain. We're not going to have a boss. When we agree on the priority and the conflicts between those 6, that's when we have a group. So, you know, it's the ultimate form of bonding.
Yeah.
Is to share a perspective on those moralities.
Yeah. And understanding how we're going to work together.
Yes.
Awesome team exercise.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
It is the ultimate team exercise.
Yeah.
Because that's what groups are about.
Yeah. And I can't believe that we already filled an hour. I have the
Yes.
impression that we just started
Yes.
and I could go on in this new direction now.
Yeah.
But if someone fell asleep after minute 1, just woke up and thought, I thought you're talking about rules of talking and now you're talking about morality. What was this
Yes.
all about?
Yeah.
What would you like them to take
Well,
away?
what I would say is that, once again, there's some amazing books in the literature on the processes of talking. But what I've tried to do in my book, 10 Rules for Talking, is emphasize that in order for us to follow those processes, we have to understand some of the dynamics that lie beneath the processes. And, that is things like critical thinking, relationships, which include morality, personal resilience, and that's what the book talks about as well, is the foundations upon which we can apply the process that allow us to have successful conversations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing, Tim.
Well, thanks for having me, and lovely to talk.
Wonderful. Dum da da dum. Yay!
Yeah.
Wow. That was even better than the first one.
Well, the second time often is. I wasn't sorry when you told me that we were going to have to do it again, because it's nice to have another go at it.
Yeah, and I really liked. I think this time the flow from rules of talking and workshops to the teams and the sports world was much more smooth.
Yeah.
And I think that there was so many aha moments for me from this. Okay, what if we look on business from a sports perspective?
Yeah.
And I love the morality piece.
Yeah. It's it is a good one. It's really worked well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Wonderful. And since we recorded quite quickly now after, you will be out actually next week.
Oh, okay. I'll look forward to that.
Yeah. So that I don't have to delay the schedule just because of me. So we'll send it to the editor right now and write the summary and send you the summary within the next, before the end of the week. Okay. Then you can review it.
Great.
And if you have some links also to the multiple books that you mentioned.
Okay, I'll do that.
Yeah.
I'll email you those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you. So enjoy your evening. I hope that you can go downstairs now where it's a little bit cooler.
Yeah.
I'll do the same.
Oh, really? Okay. All right. I know. Okay. Yeah. All right. Nice to talk.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye, Miriam.